Listen closely. Because this isn't just another story about a homeowners association gone too far. This is the story of how the HOA tried to push me out of my own lake cabin. And how I made them pay. I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened, word by word, because the moment you hear how far they went to intimidate me, you're going to realize why I did what I did. Picture this. A quiet morning at the lake. The sun was just starting to rise, golden light shimmering off the water. I was standing on the dock with my coffee in hand, breathing in the fresh air, thinking about how peaceful life was supposed to be out here. But then, the peace was broken. I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel road that led to my cabin. And when I turned around, I saw them, 3 HOA board members, dressed up like they owned the place. Clipboards in hand, sunglasses on their faces, walking straight up my driveway as if they had the right to be there. Their leader, a woman named Karen, yeah, that's actually her name, marched straight up to me and said, "You're in violation of our community agreement. This cabin doesn't belong to you. You need to vacate immediately." I took a long sip of my coffee, looked her right in the eye, and said, "Vacate? This cabin has been in my family for 40 years. You don't get to decide who lives here." She snapped back, "Oh, we do. The HOA controls this property now. And if you don't leave willingly, we'll fine you every single day until you can't afford to stay." Her 2 sidekicks stood behind her, nodding like little soldiers. They thought they were intimidating me. They thought I was just going to pack up and leave. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. Because I had a plan. See, the HOA didn't realize that the cabin wasn't just some little house on a lake. It wasn't just a vacation spot. It was built on land that had lease agreements written decades ago. Agreements that I now controlled. So when they threatened to force me out, I let them keep talking. I let them dig their own grave with their words. Karen waved her clipboard in my face and said, "If you don't sign these documents, you're going to regret it. We'll take this cabin back one way or another." I smiled. A slow, steady, confident smile. And I said, "Sign documents? How about this? Why don't you take a closer look at who actually owns the land underneath your precious HOA?" Her eyes narrowed. She didn't like my tone. But I could see the slight twitch of uncertainty on her face. She knew something wasn't adding up. I turned, walked back into my cabin and came out with a folder. Inside that folder? Original lease agreements signed years ago. Agreements that said the entire community actually sat on land owned by my family. Karen snatched the papers from my hand and started reading. And the more she read, the paler her face got. This can't be right," she stammered. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "Oh, it's right. And you know what that means? It means you don't control me. It means I control you. And if you think you're going to kick me out of my cabin, you've got another thing coming." She handed the papers back, her hands shaking just a little. But she tried to hold her ground. "Even if that's true," she said, "we still set the rules. We still enforce the fees. You're outnumbered." I laughed. A deep, steady laugh that cut through the morning air. Outnumbered? No, Karen. You're outsmarted. Because here's what they didn't know. I had already prepared new lease agreements. Agreements that tripled the fees they had to pay to stay on my land. I let them stand there, smug, thinking they still had power. And then I dropped the bomb. "Starting today," I said, "every single one of your lease fees has been tripled. And if you don't like it, you can pack up your things and leave the lake behind." They froze. One of the sidekicks finally spoke up, his voice cracking just a little. You can't do that." I took a step forward, looked him dead in the eye and said, "Watch me." And that was the moment the power shifted. The HOA came to kick me out. But instead, I turned the tables. And this was just the beginning. Because if they thought triple fees were bad, they had no idea what else I had in store. But the real story started after they left that morning. See, when Karen and her 2 loyal sidekicks stormed off my property, they were furious. They didn't want to show fear in front of me, so they left with their heads held high. But I could see it. The way her hands shook, the way her eyes twitched, the way she barely kept her voice steady. They were shaken. And that was exactly what I wanted. Now, if you've ever dealt with an HOA, you know one thing. They don't back down easy. When they feel their control slipping, they double down. They look for new ways to claw back power. And that's exactly what Karen did. The very next day, I received a stack of letters taped to my cabin door. Each one thicker than the last, stuffed with notices, warnings, and so-called violations. Unapproved exterior color. Non-compliant dock structure. Excessive noise after hours. Unregistered vehicle on premises. The list went on, and on, and on. They had invented a dozen violations overnight. Most of them made no sense at all. But I didn't rip the papers down. I didn't argue with their words. Instead, I kept them. I filed every single notice in a folder labeled evidence. Because I knew this wasn't just a petty fight anymore. This was war. And if they wanted to start it, I was going to finish it. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cold beer in hand, staring out at the lake. The water was still, the sun was melting into the horizon, and the world felt quiet. Except for the sound of my own thoughts. They think they can run me out, I whispered to myself. They think this cabin is just a piece of property. But they don't understand, this place is mine. This land is mine. And every move they make only makes me stronger. A week later, the HOA held an emergency meeting. They sent out flyers, emails, text messages to every resident in the community. Their goal? To publicly humiliate me. To turn my neighbors against me. To make me look like the villain who threatened their precious association. And guess what? I showed up. I walked into that meeting wearing a clean button-up shirt, boots polished, papers in hand. When I stepped into the room, the whole place went quiet. You could feel the tension, like electricity in the air. Karen stood at the front, her arms crossed, her face red with determination. She started talking loud, pointing her finger at me. This man, she said, is trying to undermine our community. He claims he owns the land underneath our homes. He thinks he can raise our fees. He thinks he can destroy everything we've built. The crowd murmured. Some people looked nervous. Others looked curious. A few glared at me, already taking her side. I waited. I let her finish. I let her spit her poison. And then, I walked to the front. I put my papers down on the table. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed through the room. And I said, Karen, you're right about one thing. I do own this land. And I can prove it. Gasps, murmurs, whispers all around. I held up the original lease agreements, documents with legal signatures that were older than anyone in that room. This, I said, is the contract that makes every house, every street, every cabin in this community dependent on this land. And who owns this land? Me. My family. Not the HOA. Not Karen. Me. The room erupted. Half the people started talking at once. Some looked horrified. Some looked relieved. Some even looked excited. But Karen? She was shaking with rage. Even if that's true, she screamed, you can't just raise our fees. You can't change the rules. I leaned in, locked eyes with her, and said loud enough for every single person to hear. Watch me. The crowd went dead silent. And then I unveiled the new lease agreements. Clean. Legal. Ironclad. Each one clearly stating that starting immediately, the lease fees for every single homeowner in that community would be tripled. Triple. The room exploded. People stood up, shouting. Some screamed at me. Some screamed at Karen. Chaos filled the air. And that's when I delivered the final blow. If you don't like it, I said, you're free to leave. Pack your things. Walk away. Because the truth is, I don't need the HOA. The HOA needs me. And that was the moment the entire community realized. The power had shifted. Part 1 was complete. They came for me. And I hit back harder. And trust me, Part 2? That's where things get even wilder. The aftermath of that meeting was pure chaos. Once the word was out that I had tripled the lease fees, the entire community erupted into a firestorm of anger, confusion, and fear. Some homeowners came to my side, saying it was about time the HOA got put in their place. But others turned against me, led by Karen's venomous whispers. Everywhere I went, I could feel their eyes on me. At the grocery store. At the gas station. Even just walking to the dock. People stared. Some nodded in respect. Others looked like they wanted to rip my head off. But I didn't flinch. Not once. See, when you take on power-hungry people like Karen and her HOA minions, you can't show fear. If you show even a crack in your armor, they'll swarm you like vultures. And I wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. So I kept living my life. I sat on my porch at sunset with a drink in my hand. I went fishing in the early mornings, letting the lake's mist cool my face. I chopped wood. I fixed my boat. I made sure everyone who looked my way saw the same message. I'm not going anywhere. But Karen? Oh, she wasn't done. Not even close. A few days after the meeting, I got a knock on my door. When I opened it, 2 men stood there, tall in cheap suits, flashing badges that looked just a little too shiny. "We're with the HOA Enforcement Committee," one of them said. His voice was sharp, clipped, like he'd practiced that line in the mirror 100 times. "We're here to discuss your non-compliance." I stared at them, blinked once, then burst out laughing. "Enforcement Committee? Really?" I said. "You two look like you bought those badges off the internet." They didn't like that. Their jaws tightened. One of them took a step forward, trying to intimidate me. "You need to come with us," he said, "or there will be consequences." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "Oh, I'm sure there will be. But they won't be for me." And that's when I dropped it on them. "See, I know exactly who you are. You're not enforcement. You're not officers. You're just HOA members who think putting on a badge makes you important. But let me tell you something. IT doesn't. Because while you're out here playing dress up, I'm the one who holds the leases. I'm the one who decides whether you even get to stay here. So why don't you think real hard before you try to pull another stunt like this?" They shifted uncomfortably, exchanging a quick look. One of them opened his mouth to say something, but I cut him off. "You have 10 seconds to get off my property." 10, 9, 8. I didn't even have to finish. They turned on their heels and walked away fast, trying to look tough but failing miserably. I watched them go, shut the door, and smiled to myself. But that smile didn't last long. Because the next move Karen made? That one was far more dangerous. She went legal. A week later, I received a thick envelope in the mail. Inside was a stack of legal documents, a lawsuit. The HOA was taking me to court, claiming that my lease agreements were invalid, that I had no right to control their fees, that I was abusing my power. And for the first time in this fight, I felt a tiny spark of doubt. Court was different. Court wasn't about who could shout the loudest or slap the biggest fine. Court was about facts, evidence, law. And if they found a loophole? If they found a judge who sided with them? Everything I had built, everything I had fought for could come crashing down. But doubt didn't last long. Because I knew the truth. I knew the history of this land better than anyone else. And I knew that as long as I stood tall, the law was on my side. So I called my lawyer. A sharp, ruthless man named Carter. And when I told him what was going on, he laughed. "They don't have a case," he said. "And if they try to push it, we'll destroy them in court." His confidence was like gasoline on a fire. It ignited me all over again. And right then I made a decision. If the HOA wanted to go to war in court, I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to attack. I wasn't just going to win. I was going to crush them. The courtroom was cold. Not just from the air conditioning, but from the way everyone's eyes felt like they were mating you out, weighing you, measuring the weight of your sin or your truth. I walked into that room with Carter by my side, papers neatly stacked, a calm I had purposefully trained myself to wear like armor. The judge sat high, a woman with steely eyes who seemed to see through people. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table, looking smaller than she ever did in the community hall. No clipboard, no crowd to back her up. Just her face, her anger, her pride, sitting there like a thorn. The opening arguments were predictable. Karen's lawyer, a smooth-tongued man who lived for dramatic pauses, talked about community standards, rules, and order. He painted me like some rogue landowner who wanted to raise fees out of spite. He tried to make it personal. He tried to make it mean that I was attacking neighbors. Carter stared at him for half a second, then stood. "Your Honor," he said, "this case is not about petty grudges. It is about the legal ownership of the land and the validity of the leases that govern it. We have original documents, signatures, and precedent. The facts are blunt." Carter didn't yell. He didn't need to. He let the documents do the talking. And he let the evidence lay out the story like a row of meaningful steps that could not be ignored. Then it was my turn. I walked up to the stand. I spoke slow. I paused when necessary. I let every line land. This was not the time for showboat lines or rancor. This was where facts met heart. "Your Honor," I said, "I did not raise the fees to make people suffer. I did it because this community has been run by people who forgot who owns the ground. I did it because when they tried to push me out, I had to show that power without justice is a dangerous thing." I watched the judge's face. Her pen stopped moving. The room felt tight. The opposing side tried every trick. They called witnesses who saw things differently. They called experts who talked about HOA authority like it was a religion. But Carter was methodical. He picked their testimonies apart with questions that made the soul of the argument unravel. And then, the moment that changed everything, Carter called the archive keeper. She walked in, an old woman whose hands shook when she grabbed the boxes. She was the sole living witness to the original land deals. Her voice was quiet, but what she said was a clothed truth. "These leases are original," she said. "These signatures are real. We kept them because someday someone might need to know." She testified about meeting my grandfather, about the transactions, about how the community was built around a leasehold that the HOA simply administered. IT did not own the underlying land. Karen sat straight up. There was a quiver in her lip. She tried to hold the room, but the room was slipping. After 3 days of testimony, 2 motions, and a lot of legal dance, the judge made a ruling. She didn't slam a hammer down like in movies. She delivered it in the tone of someone who had looked at paper and history and decided whose story held. "This court finds that the plaintiffs have failed to demonstrate that the defendant lacks authority over the underlying leasehold," she said. "The case is dismissed." A wave of noise hit the room. Some people cried. Some laughed. Some swore under their breath. Karen's attorney stood there, the color draining from his face. She looked at me. I looked back. No victory lap. Just the quiet of a battle won and the knowledge that this wasn't the end. When we walked out of that courtroom, the media didn't go wild. It was a small river town. News travels fast, but IT doesn't love drama the way cities do. Still, for a week people talked. Heads turned gratitude my way. Others lent glances of suspicion. But the wind made something worse happen. IT made Karen dangerously determined. She was humiliated, and humiliation is a breed of desperation. She went into a mode of calculated, quiet planning. She knew the law had failed her. She knew she couldn't beat me with paper anymore. So she looked for other tools. That night I got a message on a slim app. No name. No number. Just a photo of my front porch, shadowed, a footstool flipped over. The message was short: "You won the battle. Not the war." I didn't answer. I saved the photo. I called Carter. We talked about security, about what humiliation does to people, about how desperate moves are often the most dangerous. They began to settle things. My boat was vandalized one morning. IT wasn't much, but it was messed with. A window broken. A graffiti tag scarred on a dock post. Small things meant to send a message: we can touch your life if you don't relent. I know what you're thinking. Why not call the police? Why not escalate? I did that. The police took reports, they patrolled. But the truth is, when a community turns on you, law enforcement can only do so much. The real battle is for people's hearts, and Karen was working that angle hard. So I did something different. I decided to shine a light. I called an emergency community barbecue. I put up flyers. I sent messages. I told them I was hosting a night for everyone who wanted to talk about the future of the lake. I knew some people would not come. I knew Karen would mock it. But I wanted to remind everyone of the human side of this place. That night families came. Old men with hands that used to work the docks. Kids with fishing rods. Women with salads and tins. People who had been silently watching all this play out. They came and something shifted. I spoke from the porch. I didn't rant. I said simple things. I talked about her grandfather who built the cabin, about the summer we all saw fireworks, about why the lake meant more than any fee or form. I talked about restoring respect. Some people stood up for me that night. Others walked away. But a whole bunch of folks stayed, and more importantly, they listened. Karen stood in the shadows with her arms crossed. She didn't speak to me. But I saw her eyes, and in them was the same thing I had seen on the dock that first morning: resolve. Different. Harder. Darker. I knew then, beneath the relief of the court win, that what was coming next would not be about legal papers or public meetings. What was coming next was personal. It would touch family names. It would push people to choose sides. And if I had any hope of keeping this community together, I had to think farther ahead. I had to prepare. So I called in favors. I solicited loyalties quietly. I talked to old friends who still had influence. I arranged for a couple of security cameras. I locked the cabin with authority. But most importantly, I made a plan that wasn't about punishing everyone who disagreed with me. It was about protecting what mattered. Because when people get hurt, when places get broken, IT isn't enough to win in court. You have to win back trust. And that is a job that takes time, thick skin, and sometimes sacrifice. As part 2 closed, the battle lines were drawn. Karen had lost the lawsuit, but she wasn't finished. She had more tricks, more rage, more networks of people willing to hurt to save face. I stood on my porch looking at the lake, night wind whispering across the water. I knew this wasn't a victory parade. It was a breath between storms. And I knew part 3 would be the storm that the courtroom was packed. Every seat taken. Every eye fixed on me and Karen as we sat on opposite sides of that polished wooden room. It felt like the whole community had shown up, some to see me fall, some to see Karen finally put in her place. The judge entered, a stoic figure with a face carved from stone. He banged his gavel and the room fell silent. Case number 4752. Homeowners Association versus Leaseholder. My lawyer, Carter, stood with calm confidence. Your Honor, this case is a waste of the court's time. The HOA is claiming power they never legally had. The lease agreements are ironclad and we're prepared to prove it. Karen's lawyer, a nervous little man with glasses sliding down his nose, jumped up. Your Honor, this individual has taken advantage of our community. He's tripled fees illegally. He's abusing his position. The homeowners deserve justice. The judge looked at me. Mr. Leaseholder, do you have anything to say for yourself? I stood, straightened my jacket, cleared my throat, and when I spoke, my voice echoed through that courtroom like thunder. Your Honor, the only abuse of power here is the HOAs. They've harassed residents. They've invented rules to control everyone's lives. And when I finally stood up to them, they fabricated this case. But I have one thing they don't: the original land lease signed by the developers, filed with the county, and upheld by law. I held up the document, sealed, official, undeniable. The room gasped. Even Karen went pale. My lawyer stepped in. We'll submit this into evidence, Your Honor. It clearly states that our client holds the right to set and modify lease fees. Any claim to the contrary is void. The judge took the document. Read it. Then nodded slowly. This is valid. Karen jumped to her feet. No, this isn't fair. He's a bully. He thinks he can walk all over us. The judge slammed the gavel. Sit down, Miss Karen. This courtroom isn't about feelings. It's about law. The room erupted in murmurs. I stayed still, stone-faced, but inside I felt the tide turning. Karen's lawyer tried to fight back, throwing out technicalities, questioning dates, trying to cast doubt. But every time, Carter cut him down with facts, with documents, with precedents. It was like watching a master swordsman against an amateur with a wooden stick. By the time the judge called for a recess, it was clear to everyone: the HOA was losing. Karen sat slumped in her chair, her face red, her hands shaking. I didn't say a word. I just watched her break piece by piece. But I knew this fight wasn't over yet. Because when a cornered animal has nothing left to lose, that's when they're most dangerous. When the court resumed after recess, the energy in that room was electric. Everyone knew the HOA was slipping, but Karen wasn't ready to let go. She stood, her voice shaking but loud enough to fill the room. Your Honor, this man is a threat to our community. If you let him win, he'll destroy everything we've built. The judge fixed her with a stare that could freeze stone. Miss Karen, the only thing I see destroying this community is the HOA's abuse of power. Now sit down. Her face turned a shade of red I didn't think humanly possible, but she obeyed. My lawyer Carter stood again, his voice steady, cold, and final. Your Honor, we ask that the court not only dismiss this lawsuit with prejudice but also rule that the HOA cease all unlawful enforcement actions against residents. It's time their power be formally stripped. The judge leaned back in his chair, thinking, his fingers drumming against the wood. Then, he delivered the words that would change everything. Case dismissed. The HOA has no grounds to stand on. Leaseholders' rights are upheld. Effective immediately, the HOA's authority to enforce fines or fees is revoked. The room exploded. Some cheered. Some shouted in outrage. Karen let out a choked cry, her entire world crumbling before her eyes. I just sat there, silent, letting the victory speak for itself. But I wasn't finished. When the noise died down, I stood, looked right at Karen, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "You tried to take my cabin. You tried to break me. But all you did was destroy yourself. This community doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people. And I'm making sure they never have to live under your tyranny again." The crowd erupted again, but this time it was mostly cheers. People who had been too afraid to speak up finally found their voices. Karen stormed out of the courtroom, her lawyer scrambling after her. And in that moment I knew, the war was over. Back at the lake cabin, the air felt different. Cleaner. Freer. It wasn't just the wind rustling through the pines or the gentle waves against the shore. It was the weight that had lifted off everyone's shoulders. Neighbors came to me one by one. Some shook my hand. Some thanked me outright. A few even apologized for taking Karen's side before. And for the first time in a long time, I felt peace in that community. We held a meeting on the dock, under the orange glow of the setting sun. No gavels. No power trips. Just people talking like human beings about what they wanted for the future. No HOA. No Karen. Just us. When it was over, I walked back to my cabin, sat on the porch and watched the last light dip below the trees. I thought about everything that had happened. How they tried to push me out. How they tried to humiliate me. How they even took me to court. And how in the end I stood my ground. The cabin was still mine. The lease fees were still tripled. And the HOA was finished. They had come at me with everything they had. And I beat them. Not just for myself, but for everyone who ever felt trapped by people like Karen. I raised a glass, whispered to the quiet lake. To freedom. To peace. To taking back what's ours. And as the moon rose over the water, I knew one thing for certain. They would never dare cross me again. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more wild HOA showdowns, and turn on the bell so you never miss the next one.